Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar called Technologies of the Energy Transition, Ultra-Fast EV Charging. I'm Marie Benedrisa, I'm a senior researcher at Esade, and it is really my pleasure to moderate this session. We'd like to thank also the Fundación Repsol for their support in this webinar, and I'm sure it will be an interesting one. So today we'll be discussing electric vehicle charging in the EU. As you know, as new battery electric vehicle registrations continue to rise across the EU, it will be critical to foresee the necessary infrastructure to allow EV users to charge their cars when and where it makes sense for them. And that's a big challenge. It's an important point as well that is picked up by the European Green Deal, and there is in fact a target to create 1 million charging points by 2025. However, the present number is currently only around a quarter or a third of that. Moreover, the distribution across the Union is very uneven. 70% of charging stations are currently concentrated in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. And so in addition to the distribution of charging stations, speed is also an issue. Consumers are demanding faster charging times, and EV manufacturers are progressively introducing EVs with higher power charging levels. This, in turn, then means that charging points need to be equipped to handle the demand, and that poses technological questions, particularly in locations with capacity restrictions. So I've mentioned a couple of issues here already: distribution, the number of chargers, the speed of the chargers, but there's many others that we would like to discuss. And I'm not going to take up more time discussing these issues because we actually have a set of fantastic speakers with us today to analyze these issues. So let me right away go ahead and introduce our panel, because we are thrilled to have with us really kind of a range of stakeholders across the EV charging chain, as well as a policy expert. So I'll start with presenting Siridia Berenguer. She is the new commercial business BD director at Repsol. She is an industrial engineer with degrees in business, and she's held multiple roles at Repsol over the years. Her focus now is on low carbon emissions projects in the commercial area, and that includes e-mobility, distributed generation, and new mobility services. So Siridia, happy to have you with us. I'll go on and present our next speaker, who is Julia Hildermeier. Julia is an associate at the Regulatory Assistance Project, also known as RAP. She is an expert in electromobility and transport, and she focuses on the benefits of integrating electrified transport in a smarter and decarbonized power market. Her field is essentially research and policy analysis, as well as outreach in Brussels and beyond. So Julia, again, happy to have you with us. I will move on to our third speaker, who is Xavier Pons. Xavier is the head of infrastructure and energy services at Nissan Iberia. His background is in business, and his 20 years of professional experience have primarily been concentrated in the automotive sector, with over 8 years in EVs, electric vehicles. And so he's focusing on how EVs are reshaping both the automotive and the energy industry. Thanks for joining us, Xavier. And finally, we have with us as well Álvaro Vázquez. He is the head of e-mobility in Spain for ABB. He's an electromechanical engineer with a degree in business, and his career has been in business development in multiple segments. His current role at ABB focuses on charging infrastructure, services, and development. So it's really wonderful to have everybody with us today. As you can see, we're really spanning kind of the value chain across charging. That was the objective of this webinar. Let's bring all of these different segments together. And we'll be discussing really important questions today, so we're looking forward to it. Now, before we get into the discussion, I'd also like to welcome our audience. Thank you to our listeners for being with us. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so please do use the chat, the YouTube chat, to send in your questions, and we will bring those in later on. So, without any further ado, let's start with our first interventions by our speakers. And I've asked them in their first interventions to focus on a series of headline questions from their areas of expertise. And those questions are: how can fast and ultra-fast charging infrastructure be expanded in the EU? What are the biggest challenges to ultra-fast and fast charging at present? And how can cooperation across the value chain be enhanced to further deploy ultra-fast charging infrastructure? a set of important and challenging questions, but I'm sure our speakers are going to be very much capable of answering them. And so we'll start with Julia Hildermeyer. Again, thanks for joining us, and please, the floor is yours for your views. I believe Julia is preparing her slides to share with us.
Exactly. I've shared my screen now. I hope you can see that.
Yes, perfect.
Great, perfect. So thanks very much for inviting me to speak at this webinar. It's a timely topic. And I would like to approach the topic of EV charging infrastructure and ultra-fast charging infrastructure in particular from a regulatory side. At RAP, which is short for Regulatory Systems Project, we're a group of policy advisors working on the clean energy transition. So when we look at EV charging infrastructure, we look at it from two angles. We look at it in terms of how it can best meet customer needs. So where do people want to charge, at which speed, based on which use case, but also how charging infrastructure can integrate with the power grid in an optimal way. And when I say optimal, we could also say beneficial. This really means to reduce cost for consumers, for example, by helping them to use the grid when power prices are lowest, to reduce the cost for the grid or for the system overall, and to reduce the cost for the environment, for example, by helping to integrate or to use more renewable electricity for EV charging. And with this perspective, ultra-fast charging has really its place as part of a larger vision around EV charging. And I put it on the screen here. EV drivers everywhere should have ready access to sufficient, accessible, and smart charging infrastructure to fit their needs at attractive prices. In other words, building EV charging infrastructure is about establishing an essential charging network, that's what we've called it, based on which a market for charging services can develop. For many people, charging at home or close to home is still the dominant way of charging, so this essential charging network will likely contain a balanced mix of normal, fast, and ultra-fast charging. So where could ultra-fast charging, as part of this sort of bigger essential charging network that we would like to see across Europe, where would ultra-fast charging make sense? Well, obviously along highways. I think that is a no-brainer. But also in cities, especially at mobility hubs where people need to make shorter stops and need to charge quickly. I'm thinking here of commercial fleets, such as taxis or ride-sharing cars. And where could these locations be? They could be at petrol stations, they could be at supermarket parkings or similar. But once we've identified these use cases, planners also need to start to think about how EVs can be charged most beneficially. And then more questions need to be asked. For example, do we really need to expand a grid connection at a particular location? Or is there enough capacity, perhaps not so far away? Or could we perhaps optimize the charging so we don't have to build expensive grid upgrades? And that is, of course, really important to ask, especially when we think about building ultra-fast charging infrastructure, because it involves high capacity. And when we can avoid grid upgrades, we can avoid, through optimized charging or optimized location, we can avoid substantial cost for the charging point operator, but also for the customer and for the system, and therefore eventually for all electricity users. So how do we get there? 2 points I want to quickly cover. First, through grid integrated planning, and second, through a supportive EU policy framework that makes charging smart. So grid integrated planning is particularly important for ultra-fast charging because of the higher capacity it's involved and the cost. And to keep these costs in check, location is really key. And the ideal location for ultra-fast charging will depend on two things. It will depend on charging demand, so actually where do people want to charge with their specific use case, but it will also depend on where there's already capacity on the grid, so the charging network can be built with least cost to the grid. And companies and authorities are already working together across Europe to study where capacity is available and basically to identify these best locations, overlaying two maps with two factors, mobility and capacity. And I've put on the slide one example of a tool that can help to do this. This is an open hosting capacity map. It is based on grid data from network companies that are participating in this particular project in the UK. But there are also other projects across Europe. And this map gives you information about the particular locations, or to be precise, substations at a particular location. And it shows you what capacity is available to build your charging station. And you can see that in 3 locations, you can build a charging station up to 150 kilowatt. Now this is just one example, but it would imply that you could build this charging station with no additional grid upgrade cost applied. And this is the kind of help to build an ultra-fast charging network at ideal locations. But there's more to grid integrated planning. I just want to mention, it's also about aligning planning horizons. You may know grid operators plan maintenance and grid developments for years to come, but the ultra-fast charging market is likely to be much more dynamic, evolving faster and with shorter timeframes. So getting these 2 planning horizons to align is really crucial to avoid cost. To put it in other terms, we want to avoid digging up the ground for grid maintenance and then digging it up again a year later to build a fast charger. Ideally, you would do 2 things at the same time. And then, last but not least, grid integrated planning is also about adding smart charging capabilities from the outset to the infrastructure to allow behind-the-meter optimization. And the key message here is really ultra-fast charging needs to be smart. And to ensure ultra-fast charging is smart, we need a supportive policy framework on EU level, but also on national level. And I'll cover this as the last point of my short input. What are the main ingredients of a supportive policy framework to help integrate ultra-fast charging beneficially into the grid? First and foremost, we need time-varying pricing. The better, or the more accurate, or you could also say the more reflective of what's happening on the grid, the price signals are that arrive at the charging point, the better EVs can adjust and optimize their charging. And by doing so, save cost. Save cost for the service operator and save cost for the consumer. And this is just as valid even for shorter time windows that the vehicle spends at the charging point when we think of ultra-fast charging. With the addition, perhaps, that those price signals would need to be more granular. And time varying or ideally dynamic pricing is needed for both, for electricity prices, that's the power purchased, but also concerning the networks, so the price on using the grids for EV charging. And these, in many European countries, are not dynamic enough to really help charge EVs beneficially. And in this context, it will be interesting to see the learnings, in particular from Spain, that has introduced a new network tariff since summer last year, that allows consumers to contract capacity cheaper at non-peak hours, because this, of course, helps to drive consumption, such as EV charging, to off-peak hours and use capacity at lower prices. But more than that, we also need transparency of data, and in particular, transparency on what's happening on the grids and collaboration with grid operators, for example, through pilot projects. And of course, to be able to do all this and unlock this multitude of services around optimized charging, particularly relevant to ultra-fast charging, we need charging points that are capable of measuring and communicating consumption, in other words, that are smart. And this should be standard everywhere across Europe. And for ultra-fast charging in particular, smartness can be around power sharing, so grouping of chargers to adjust the charging depending on how many vehicles charge at the same time. It can be about adding a local battery storage, and we may hear more about this on today's panel. But midterm, we need to be thinking about EV fleets of passenger EVs, but even also fleets of electric vans or electric trucks that we see electrifying rapidly. So it's about enabling the charging infrastructure to be able to deal with these different uses. And of course, it's also about exploring possible combinations with, for example, on-site renewable generation. Think of solar panels on the rooftop of a supermarket or a warehouse. So with all of this, introducing dynamic tariffs and smart charging can help to unlock these benefits. And this can be helped by national regulators through pilot projects, for example, and tariff reform. And let me just close by saying that there are several policies discussed also at European level that could help deploying these, let's say, conditions for ultra-fast charging to happen and to grow in a beneficial way. And I'm more than happy to discuss more of these in the discussion we're going to have later. So with this, I think I've given enough aspects to discuss, and I thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Julia. You made a number of excellent points, which I'm sure that some of our other speakers will also be touching on, and we'll have time to speak a little bit more in the Q&A. But I've noted down essentially your points about the cost effectiveness of this deployment, which is really going to be very, very important, and balance to make sure that the correct infrastructure is made at the right places as well. So those are a few of the points, which you made a lot of them, but those are a few of the points that I noted down here. So thanks for that. We've got some initial meat to chew on, let's say, and let's move forward with our next speaker. So our next speaker is Siridia from Repsol. So Siridia, thanks again for joining us. And if you'd like to give us your views on fast and ultra-fast charging at present, those would be very welcome.
Perfect. Thank you, Maria. And of course, thanks to Esade for organizing this session. It's a pleasure being part of it, talking about such an interesting topic. And for Repsol, e-mobility is a clear opportunity to accompany our 20 million customers across energy transition, being able to deliver, as we've done so far, the energy they need also when they decide to switch to new energy sources, such as electricity. Nevertheless, if I may, the first thought I wanted to share today is that we should all be aware that the present and even more the future of mobility is multi-energy. It's impossible to think that the mobility sector evolution and the transport decarbonization come through a single energy source. The situation, problem, circumstances, and challenges for light-duty vehicles and private mobility have nothing to do with for heavy duty, for long distance, or what to say about marine or air transport. So having the client and the client needs at the center of our strategy, we think it's very important to have this always in mind. And having said so, we truly believe e-mobility will play a key role in our mobility in the future. And this belief for Repsol is not just today's. More than 10 years ago, we entered the e-mobility business, creating Ibil, the first so-called, by that time, charging manager in Spain, when there were less than a handful of electric vehicles on the roads. And this early beginning has given us the possibility to learn all these years about the business, the clients, their necessities, the technology evolution. And since then, we've built one of the most significant charging networks in the country, including the first ultra-fast charging station in Iberia by 2019, and some months after, the most powerful one in Southern Europe with more than 400 kilowatts. So the truth is that EV penetration is still limited in Spain, that's a fact, especially when compared to other EU countries, with an EV park that, although it has been growing significantly for the last years, is still scarce compared to total figures. Nevertheless, or maybe especially because of this, different elements allow us to foresee material market development in the near future, such as new regulations, as Julia just explained, and challenging European and national plans. Promoting measures such as subsidies have a strong impact in EV penetration as an accelerating factor. So we are confident these elements will promote this expected growth. Julia mentioned before, what are the two main concerns for prospective EV drivers? Nowadays, basically two. On the one hand, price. Total cost of ownership for EVs has been historically and is still higher when compared to ICEs. And not to mention purchasing power in Spain, clearly below other European countries. But on the other hand, energy. Where and how to recharge my vehicle. As you all know, and Julia also mentioned, it's considered that the largest part of the recharges will happen at home, around 80%. Still, one of the main concerns of prospective EV drivers and one of the main obstacles for buying an EV is where will I recharge when at public thoroughfare? The so-called range anxiety. Will I really get home to my destination or to the next charging point before I run out of battery? That's the point. And when we come to talk about charging, of course, again, this is not a single solution problem or decision because, as I said in the beginning, different circumstances and different needs leads to different possibilities and solutions. Taking into account our time, the price, convenience, power availability, the charging solution for us and for a specific need is different. It's kind of ridiculous to think about ultra-fast charging point at home where the car will be parked for hours. And it's equally useless to install public slow chargers, especially when the customer is looking for a convenient and as fast as possible recharge. In fact, Repsol's public deployment considers only fast and ultra-fast chargers from 50 kilowatt up to 400. And by the end of this year, more than 1,000 public chargers will be operative within our network, offering fast and ultra-fast charging every 50 kilometers in the main national transport corridors. This goal is not about profitability, or at least not in the short midterm, with an still reduced EV park and having to face abusive investments and fixed costs, not mentioning the difficulties regarding regulation, permits, and licenses when talking about higher power demands, such as ultra-fast. Because of this, and because we really think strategically located high-power chargers will be key to make this new mobility grow, it's very important to mention the role played by subsidies, regional, national, and European, and public-private and private-private agreements to join forces. And having Nissan and having Xavier Pons with us today, impossible not to mention the strategic agreement for the deployment of public EV chargers signed by Repsol and Nissan last year. We are really proud of having Nissan as a partner. For Repsol, it's clear, if we want to help the market and the client shift to e-mobility, we have to understand the client concerns and try to solve them, and ultra-fast charging will be for sure a key piece in the long term.
Thank you, Saridia, for a very clear, I think, presentation, and particularly also for kind of zooming in a little bit more towards where most of us are presenting from today, which is Spain. So we'll get back to some of your points, I think, later on in the presentation. I think some of the other speakers will also be picking up on your points. But one of the points that I think we should discuss is this uneven deployment across Europe, and we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. So thanks a lot for your presentation. We'll move on to our next speaker then, who is Xavier Pons of Nissan. So Xavier, you're of course here presenting the views of an EV manufacturer in this case. And so we're really interested in seeing your points of views on the expansion of this infrastructure, the main challenges at present, the potential for cooperation with the cost of value chain. So looking forward to your views.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Esade, for this opportunity to be here today. I'm very pleased to share this event with my colleagues, with the speakers which are today with me. Okay, first of all, I would like to provide the audience with some background on why Nissan is invited to a kind of roundtable like this, which is covering a topic like fast charging, which is somehow, from our perspective, we are behind the barrier about fast charging. Now we are the one that we're manufacturing the cars, so we are somehow far from that, let's say, topic. But of course, we launched the first mass production electric vehicle back 12 years ago, but we've done much more than that. For the last 12 years, Nissan has devoted lots of resources in charging infrastructure projects to boost the availability of public charging options for EV drivers. One of the most remarkable, as Siridia just commented, was the one signed between Repsol and Nissan back 2 years ago. So with this background, you can imagine we've learned a lot along the way. So having said so, and coming to the particular topic about the fast charging question, I think that the first question we should address ourselves is, who are we targeting when planning to deploy ultra fast charging infrastructure or fast and ultra fast charging infrastructure? Of course, we know that ultra fast charging is needed in order to make EVs comparable to ICE cars in terms of convenient times for refilling. But when we are thinking of this kind of investments, we should also take into account that refilling is the refilling habits will differ significantly from ICE cars drivers to EV drivers, because a good bunch of these EV drivers will charge at home on a regular basis. With that in mind, we observe mainly, we could say, about three groups to address this or this charging offering. First of them being the drivers who lack access to home charging, so they will need, as it was already said by my colleagues, some convenient alternatives to charge their cars on a periodic basis. Second, drivers willing to cover long distances will also ask for charging services in a reasonable amount of time. And then after, maybe last, the drivers with a heavy use of their vehicles within metropolitan areas, like last mile delivery fleets, taxi services, etc. With those will be in mind, but we should also, so the most important decisions that investors and CPOs must take are related to the following questions. Let's say the first one being, where should these ultra fast charging stations be installed? There were some very interesting comments coming either from Julia and from Cirilia in that regard. We have to be reminded that the station running costs are substantial. So utilization rate is key to make the station economically viable, if not a real business, but at least not that much a loss-making asset, right? So the right location will make the difference between a high utilization rate station or a low traffic one. Most of the CPOs currently are using AI technology and algorithms to point the locations that will pull them with more usage and traffic, right? Second question is, what is the right size for each of the stations? The station size will, on one side, drive running cost, and on the other, make charging more or less available in those crowded stations. So again, spotting the right size of the station will be critical to balance utilization rate and chargers availability. And last but not least, the third question is, how should we address the charging offering to each of the target audiences? CPOs will compete each other for those drivers, that's clear. Each of those groups will need a charging service adapted to their needs, and all them together should provide the CPO, again, with a balance between the utilization rate of each group and the charges availability. If you can go, please, ahead to the next slide, please, Mary. Talking about challenges, which are the challenges lying ahead of us when talking about this deployment? There are lots of them, but I would like to focus on some of them that, from my point of view, are, let's say, the more remarkable. First of all, the grid constraints. It was already mentioned by Julia in her intervention. Ultra-fast charging stations requires big amounts of power to work, and this power is not often available, and huge grid investments and reinforcements are needed. What might make the whole investment or the whole business, let's say, not viable, right? So in these cases, subsidies programs and tax credits supporting the whole investment are of great importance to CPOs, and we should push, I think, our governments to keep backing them, right? Second one, investment and running costs. I already said that investments and running costs are huge, so CPOs and infrastructure owners need to balance station locations and size and adapt them to demand. So flexibility will be key to address this challenge, and deploying scalable assets like power transformer stations, scalable charging units, etc., are crucial to reach this flexibility. Third one, user experience, and this one comes from my personal experience. I love to drive EV cars. I love it from the very first time I drove one of them. But when it comes to public infrastructure, my recent experience were not that good. No? Any EV driver, needs to have with him several charging cars or charging apps in order to have a clear overview and access to the infrastructure around. But what is worse is that once he's in front of the chargers, there are bugs that happen very often regarding communication between the charger and the backend, or between the charger and the car, or whatever. So I think that we all should take reliability as a very serious subject, right? And last one of the challenges, I think, is regulation and permitting processes. It was already mentioned. I would like to point that, at least from my experience here in Spain, there are different public administrations involved in the authorization of a charging service facility, depending on the country and the region. And the criteria each of these public administration used to assess these installations are dramatically different. Regulation in this regard should be harmonized all over the regions in order to provide both CPOs and investors with some certainty about the time lapse needed to fulfill these installations, right? And next slide, please, Marie. So, and finally, regarding cooperation, which I think, as Julie and also Sylvia said, which is crucial, the cooperation between different entities and administrations. I guess cooperation between the different agents will make the most out of the different efforts and resources we devote to this kind of projects. I will just point some examples that came to my mind when preparing this session. First of them, storage. Right? We said that flexibility in those stations is key. Recently, so nowadays, car manufacturers like Nissan recycle every year lots of battery modules that are no longer usable in cars, but are still useful for other applications. This energy storage is a very interesting asset to cope with grid constraints, and actually, we are currently cooperating with several CPOs who are willing to add this storage to their facilities. The second one to bear in mind is the bundling offering. As the, let's say, the agreement we have with Repsol, we are exploring different formula with different CPOs to make infrastructure more accessible and affordable to customers, but also to somehow provide some guarantee on the revenue streams that the CPO will get in the future, so that the whole investment somehow is more viable from the very beginning. And last one, interoperability. As I pointed earlier, nowadays EV drivers must carry around either several charging cars or charging apps in order to have access to the nearby infrastructure. I know that CPOs are committing lots of resources when investing in charging infrastructure, and accordingly are not willing to provide access to other competing CPOs customers. But we must somehow find a recipe to make EV drivers' life easier while protecting those CPOs' interests. And that's it from my side. Thank you all, and we'll be happy to come back to you should any question or doubt arise.
Thanks, Xavi. We'll certainly get into some questions later. So thanks for bringing in this view. I think very interesting points on all of the questions, and kind of bringing in the business perspective of the EV manufacturers, of the charging point operators, of the customers, including first-hand experience. So thanks for that. Great points, which we'll certainly come back to. So now we'll go to our final speaker, and our final speaker is Álvaro Vázquez, who's going to be presenting here the views of ABB on the questions that we're dealing with. And I'm sure that there have been a few points that have been of interest to you that the other speakers have made. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you to the attendants for this opportunity to talk about for a while about charging and high power charging and the grid connectivity. And it's a pleasure to hear the opinions of such experts. And you are amazing, and your opinion is extremely valid. But I think that we miss some point here, right? The user experience. Why we put fast, ultra fast, semi-fast chargers on the streets? It's not because we want power there, because we can. We want to satisfy customer expectations. And customer expectations means that I want to charge my car in the shortest time possible, or at least in the fittest time that I have. I mean, I don't have the same charging experience while I'm working. I have 8 hours for charging. I don't have the same charging experience when I'm having lunch with a friend. I have 2 hours for get my charging satisfaction, to get my car charged in 2 hours. I don't get the same experience when I go to the supermarket and I have half an hour to charge my car. And of course, I don't have the same experience when I go to a highway from Madrid to Vitoria, from Madrid to Valencia to Barcelona, and I want to stop as minimum as possible, the closest to the traditional car, to get the same experience. I mean, the only way of the electric cars to succeed in this in our life is doing our life normal, not changing our life to drive an EV car. So that's why the high power is becoming trending topic. For example, Repsol is absolutely aware of that. The satisfaction time in a highway, Thursday, 10 of the night, returning back home, going in the highway 2 hours from home, you don't want to be in a petrol station for half an hour waiting in your car. You want to have a stop, coffee, little walk, and go 15 minutes. To satisfy that, to fulfill that kind of customer experience, stop and go, you need power. And luckily for us, the EV manufacturers are getting to a state of the art with the cars, where the cars are able to accept the power. Now we have to provide the power. Now we know, as the chain of value in this charging business, let's say, we need to provide customer satisfaction. How we do that? First, with a car that is able to use that energy. Second, with a charger that is able to provide that energy. Third, with a station able to provide the energy required, and with the grid, and with batteries, and with half cost. But none of them makes sense without customer satisfaction. And the customers, as we can see, we have our charging time. So everything we do for customers. That are the drivers at all. Without drivers, without customer satisfaction, there is no EV business or EV world or green world. Okay? We need to go for that. That's why EV in ultra fast charging is becoming trending topic these days, because now we are able to provide customer satisfaction. 5 years ago, installing a 50 kilowatt charger in a petrol station, it was what's a deal? What's complicated. Now we can do it easily. Now we are installing 360 kilowatt in a petrol station. It's easier, and the users get more experience. If you can go to the next slide, Marie, I will think. So now we can provide. Now the users can be satisfied. Now, among all the competitors, all the installers, all the CPOs, all the utilities, all the petrol companies, we need to ensure that the customers get what they want. And that's the point we are reaching now. Now we can say that we will reach Madrid from Bilbao with one charging site, because the mix of the chargers and the cars, it's okay. But what will happen in 1 year? If I reach to a petrol station in the highway and it's occupied, I need to wait an hour, half an hour, 2 hours. So we are entering the second part. That's when the grid gets interesting. How can I install 4 chargers? How can I do the same for 6 drivers at the same time. Now we are getting to it. We need to provide satisfaction to a growing market of EV drivers. Now is where we, as ABB, we believe strongly that ultra-fast chargers are the key because makes a difference, provide satisfaction. Getting the power there, making a whole and a holistic charging experience means customer satisfaction. And that's where we are together. There is no customer satisfaction without a good EV car. There is no customer satisfaction without a good charger, without a good station to charge at and to be comfortable there, and with a good grid to provide the energy. If any of those fails, we all fail, and the driver is not happy with the electric vehicle, and we all fail providing customer satisfaction. Once we understand this, the rest is only how we can do it better, cheaper, and easier for every one of us. I thank you for the time for listening.
Thanks so much, Alvaro. So I think that the main message here is that we need the right charging infrastructure in the right places and in the right timeframes, which I think that the balance is something that our speakers have brought up repeatedly. So it's really about ultra-fast charging in the right places at the right times. So excellent. I think we have a great collection of initial points to start with here. And so here we're going to be starting our round of debate and questions. Before we do, so I'll be asking specific questions here in just a moment. Let me just remind our audience that we will be taking questions from them soon. So please do submit those via the chat. We will be taking them in just a little bit. So please do start submitting those. So let's get into some questions then. I'd like to start with Julia. So you started to speak to us a little bit more towards the end of your presentation about the EU policy framework, but I'd be happy to hear a little bit more about what you feel that is still needed in the EU policy framework to help that fast charging deployment. I know there's a lot of talk in Brussels right now on particular pieces of legislation, so I'm happy to hear your views.
Yes, thanks, Marie. And that's, of course, what is discussed on EU level now is covering on many aspects that the previous speakers have mentioned. So how can we make life easier for EV drivers at the charging station? I think that's key of throughout the different proposals that are being discussed. It covers payment, it covers data transparency, it covers pricing, and it covers also the other point that colleagues have brought up about the right size of the charging points at the right location. And I think the most important, let's say, legislative discussion we're having at the moment is on the legislative proposal called the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation that I'm sure many have heard of, in short, AFIR. And right now it's been discussed in the European Parliament and the Council of Member States. What we see, having followed these discussions through years now, is a very solid proposal that has been made by the European Commission, who have listened for years to all these different, let's say, aspects and questions we've just mentioned. But we also see that it could be approved in some aspects because we want this European framework for public charging infrastructure that this regulation is going to set for the next decade or so. We want it to be future-proof, right? And we believe that in order to make it future-proof, smartness should be required on all charging points in this framework. Right now, the proposal says that normal charging points, you can also read non-fast charging points, should be capable of smart, so capable of measuring and communicating consumption. But we also believe that there is indeed many arguments to expand this same requirements on fast charging and I think even ultra-fast charging points. Why? Because it would allow many more, let's say, optimization services around fast and ultra-fast charging if smartness was required at the beginning. You could argue that it's going to come naturally with the market, but again, this regulation is there to prepare the market for the next, for the future infrastructure that we all would like to use. And this, in our point of view, would also include retrofits. So basically upgrading infrastructure that is out there to be sure EV users can use it, and it can optimize charging. For example, if there are more EVs parked in a hub, and basically charging or the time that the EV spends at the charging point can be optimally exploited. But I should also mention two other files that are part of that are concerning infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and they're part of the Fit for 55 package that is discussed, let's say, this year in Brussels. And this is, for one, the Renewable Energy Directive. It's a directive that has some parts that contain a definition of what smart charging and bidirectional charging is. And here, a solid, let's say, legal definition would help so much to prepare, again, a market for all kinds of charging services that, would enable, business, would enable deployment, would enable, a better user experience that I think, strengthening this proposal would really help to get this market going. And I can't answer without also mentioning the sort of third, let's say, legislative proposal that is being discussed that also covers charging infrastructure from a perspective of private territory that concerns all charging points that are not in public but in private territory. It's the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. It's a small part of a law that's more covering buildings, but it does become interesting when we think about charging points that are part of workplaces, part of commercial territories, a supermarket, a warehouse, or let's say a privately owned place where commercial fleets would charge, and possibly they would want to charge fast. So this is a potential case where this law would have to would regulate, and it could help raising ambition of preparing these locations to put the, let's say, right charging infrastructure in place. It can require pre-cabling. It can so charging infrastructure can be built when it's needed, but in a lot cheaper way. Or it can even require a minimum of charging points that are already there. So the businesses that run these places can electrify their fleets much easier because they have the infrastructure already in place. So these are the three sort of main discussions that we're having, and you see that there's lots of work, lots of different aspects, but it's really interesting to look into these to understand that the EU will need a policy framework in place that helps charging infrastructure to be built in an optimal way, so e-mobility can really take off for all different use cases.
Thanks, Julia, for this overview, and I'm sure that there's a few points that perhaps other speakers might want to pick up on. So I'm going to formulate a question here for Esade, which is related to some extent. So part of the regulation around alternative fuel infrastructure is actually discussing targets, right? National targets at this moment. And so Esade, I wanted to ask you about Spain in this case. So at this point, Spain, of course, is one of the laggards if you look at the map across Europe in terms of the density of charging points, but a new target has been set by the Spanish government to reach 100,000 charging points by the end of next year. What are your views on this number, on this target for Spain?
Well, the truth is that it seems that that's the $1 million question, and nowadays you will hear about hundreds and thousands of points of recharge being announced for the coming years, without really knowing how accurate the headlines are, and without properly considering the question and the answer. What are we really talking about? How do we really satisfy the EV driver needs? The more, the better. I think it's mistaken to think that all the points of recharge are the same and fulfill the same necessity. We already talked about this. And therefore, you can just add them up so easily in order to get to a target. And I said it before, every charger type, because of location, power, services, satisfies different needs, and because of that the answer is it's not that obvious. When talking about Spain, first, there is not an official and trustworthy database with all the public chargers, and even less differentiating them. That could be like the first step. Where do we start from? But for us in Repsol, we are very much worried about how the network really works. Xavi mentioned it before, how it is maintained once deployed, and how its operativity guaranteed. It's useless having millions of chargers if no one cares if they are working or not. The biggest frustration and worst customer experience for an EV driver comes when they are about to run out of battery, they finally get to a charger and it doesn't work. Just think about a traditional service station. We all take for granted that it's going to work, that the fuel is going to be there, and that once there, we are going to get our tank full. So, what are the very basics we should be asking before the number to an electric charging network? And we always talk about like 3 musts. First, the charging points must be 100% operative. And of course, exceptions can happen and maintenance can affect this figure, but EV drivers must be confident that once they get to a charging point, they will be able to use it. Julia mentioned it, dummy chargers or chargers not connected to control centers to monitor and maintain them cannot guarantee this operativity. According to our experience, actually 95% of the problems in the network can be solved remotely, and clients don't even notice. So this is the first must. The second is the energy supplied. Energy supplied in the chargers must be 100% renewable, and it's our second must. It could be totally inconsistent to promote sustainable mobility without using 100% renewable electricity. So second red line from our point of view. And last but not least, and also mentioned before, the customer experience must be perfect. So e-mobility is a fully digital business, and things must be easy and efficient. In our case, our mobility app, Wilet, remains as the mobility energy application of choice, and the experience must be perfect. So, of course, it's very important to dimension and the dimensioning of the network, both in number of points and power for each location. It's true. But without really knowing what the magical number is, I mean, if it's the one set or if it's any other, at this early stage of this new mobility, I think it's crucial the quality and operativity of the network being deployed to be guaranteed for future EV drivers to make this shift decision. So let me insist, million chargers not working are answering your question, but not solving any problem. So that would be the message for me to be sent.
Thank you, Celia, and thank you also for picking up indeed on some of the points that the other speakers, especially Xavier, had made. In fact, I'd like to go to Xavier now, and this connects as well with something that Julia was discussing earlier, which is essentially about the optimal exploitation of available charging points. How can we facilitate cooperation between charging point operators in order to kind of more optimally exploit that? What challenges are there in that regard? I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Excuse me, I think there's a misunderstanding. Is that question addressed to me?
Yes, sorry. Yes, it's addressed to you, Xavier.
Okay. I just pointed in my presentation that I hope that there should be. I expect some more, let's say, cooperation should be put in place between the different operators, in the sense that we should make life easier to EV drivers. We all have all EV drivers, as I have for the last 8 years. We all have experiences to go around and see different charging points. They are increasing. The figures are increasing. So we see them, but sometimes we don't know who these chargers belong, and it's not always easy to find the CPO to whose belong this charging point and so on. So it will be much easier for drivers to have a kind of some kind of application or whatever tool that pull together all these charging points to provide a better user experience. In that regard, I think that there were some from the very beginning, like Object, there were some projects like GREF, like Object, that we're trying to do so. But in the end, user experience maybe is better, but costs in the end are huge. So we need to find a balance between that experience that should be smooth and should be easy to drivers, and also that that price. Also considering all the, let's say, all the points, all the care points that Julia mentioned regarding how do we make it smart and efficient regarding time slots, availability of power, availability of renewable energy on our grids, and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Javier. And I see that we're also starting to receive some questions from our audience, and particularly around some of these points that you've been mentioning, essentially the user experience, the interoperability, and we'll get to those in just a moment, but I'd like to turn to Alvaro now. And Alvaro, I was wondering whether you could bring us back a little bit to how, and you've mentioned this in your presentation, to what solutions are available when there may not be sufficient capacity at certain charging stations in order to facilitate that ultra-fast charging that you were saying was optimal. So could you just bring us a little bit towards this kind of issue of capacity and generation at the particular charging points and how that relates to ultra-fast charging?
Absolutely. And first of all, I apologize. You can see that I'm getting again and again out of the conversation. My laptop died and also my tablet. Now I'm with the phone. Sorry it works. Sorry if I fail again. So the problem here is that going back to customer satisfaction, that's with ABB always puts the first, and Repsol address the same. It doesn't matter why. It must, if the driver go there at whatever the reason, the charger is not working that expected. I mean, if I'm going for high power and get the low power, I get unhappy, let's say. Okay. For this, one of the main topics is that there is no infinite energy in every place. There are places where there are energy, and there are places that this is not. There is not energy, and this is real. No one can change that. And Spain, for good or for bad, is a wide country. It's not the same. The Basque country, with a small territory with big industries, that the Andalusia with long roads between capitals. Okay, so we need to face that. How we do that? With batteries could be an option. Batteries are expensive yet, not really a cost-effective solution, because to get power enough to get one customer could be affordable. But what happens if 10 customers come all together? That's what we all want, to have customers every day going to the petrol station, one after another. What kind of batteries we need? Only batteries? Batteries are solar panels. So the first thing that we need to address, there is no simple and easy answer to this. There is no solar panels that can charge magically 360 kilowatts in half an hour. We need, as engineers and technical experts, we need to provide to the owners, not talking about the drivers, to the owners of the station, the best solution. In the late future, in the short future, the batteries will be better, cheaper, and more efficient. The technology will be easier to install, but in the meantime, we need to be very, very professional, and it's the toughest part, because we must say to the customer, sometimes, sorry, but for you in this place, installing these chargers that you need is complex. The only thing we can address that is that we are professionals, we understand, all of us, we understand what is required, and try to find the best solution in each place for each customer. That's the thing we must face.
Thanks a lot for clarifying that, and I think it's one of the points that is coming up repeatedly. So I'm going to start bringing in some questions that we're getting from our audience at this point. And the first question that we've received is actually related to the winter here in the Northern Hemisphere. We have a question from Di Garcia Ocho, and his question is whether infrastructure challenges and battery efficiency issues exist in cold weather. I was wondering whether perhaps, I don't know, Xavier or Alvaro, you would like to answer this question? Xavier?
What I can just say about that, I don't have a technical background, but I have some knowledge on that, because what I know is that from the very beginning, when we were producing first units of Nissan Leaf that were addressed to Nordics markets, I remember those batteries were covered with kind of, let's say, technic blankets to make them to keep the higher temperature, so the efficiency of the battery and the electrons inside it is better. So what I know is that the behavior of the whole battery and the whole system is better with, let's say, a temperate temperature. So that's what I just can say. So of course there is some, let's say, impact of the temperature when it's particularly cold.
Thank you, Xavier. Alvaro, did you want to add something to this, or shall we move on to?
I can tell something as an EV driver. It's real that the cold, I live in Victoria in the north, and the cold affects the battery and the range. Something that we can maybe do is explain to the drivers how the cold affects the batteries. You can lose a 10%, a 15%. Most of the times, as a driver, talking as a driver, it's not easy to understand how my car will perform in this travel today with this temperature, and how it will charge in this charger this Tuesday driving to Madrid. As a driver, I will be very pleased if I could have better information, just to understand what is going to happen with my car. And for sure, the batteries will improve, the heating system will improve, making our life easier. That's it.
Okay, great. Information indeed seems to be key, I think, in general in this debate. I'm hearing this very often, and so the technical term would be interoperability, right? And it's essentially ensuring that our EV users can actually get access to the information, particularly about charging, and that they can have a seamless experience. And we've got a couple of questions precisely about this, about how to ensure this seamless experience, regardless of what kind of car you have, regardless of charging stations. We have questions as well about payment methods and how to integrate that. So we've had a few suggestions across the board, but I wonder if one or multiple of our speakers wants to kind of address a few of the points that could really help with this part of the question, the interoperability question. Xavier, I'm not sure whether you wanted to jump in here, or I don't know what other speakers. Yes. Julia, perhaps, and then Xavier, if you'd like to, please let me know.
Yes, happy to address this. It's of course also part of the legislative proposals that are being discussed on European level at the moment. And I think it's absolutely key that we get to a framework that enables all EV drivers, regardless of what kind of charging service they have subscribed to, or whether they're needing to charge ad hoc wherever they are, they can use a charging point, they can have access, and they get transparent information about the price for charging they will have to pay, just as it's the case at the petrol station. If you think of fossil mobility, so why should it be any different for EV drivers? It should be just as easy. And to get to that, there are many ideas currently discussed, but I think it's crucial that we start with simplifying the payment methods. And we think, from what we sort of see across different models right now, being able to pay with a debit card, a simple card, is sort of the solution that works best. And that should be available everywhere where I want to charge, added to the fact that I can pay everywhere because I have access to the charging station. So this would already help a lot to improve the charging experience that the framework we're currently discussing should give people across Europe. I'll stop here, and I'd like to get back to a few other questions of the audience in a bit.
Okay, great. So if does anybody else want to jump in on this particular question, Xavier?
Yeah, what I just wanted to stress is that the open charge protocol in direct current already allows CPOs to have lots of information from the cars and from the users, so they can, let's say, mm, stick or associate a car to a particular user and to a particular way of mode of payment. So there are some CPOs that are already deploying charge, so plug and charge solutions, so that the user just need to plug the connector into the car, and the connector itself and the charger the whole system is able to identify that user and the way it will pay the whole charging session.
Great, thank you. Thank you for adding that. So some important points for the user experience. I'd like to bring in one question here for Ceridia, which is a question by Dorian Kermadek. The question is, how realistic is it to install 5, 10, or 20 ultra-fast chargers at a large number of petroleum stations along Spanish motorways with current network capacity?
It's a challenge. I mean, it's not realistic right now. It's the truth is that, I mean, I would say there are like two big pain points. That one is the grid capacity, and the other is licenses and permits needed to do so. So no matter you have the site, no matter you have the willingness to install 5, 10, 20, or whatever number of chargers, no matter you have the money, and you want to invest and then pay for the OPEX for the coming years. Sometimes when it comes to do it, the grid capacity is a very big problem, and sometimes you have just to wait for the grid to grow or to choose another location, because no matter you have all the rest, without permissions and it's in the grid, it's impossible. So it's not that realistic, I'm afraid, but we have to do all our best to solve the problem.
Thanks, Ceridia, for this perspective. Julia, you also wanted to jump in here, and if you'd like to address a few of those other points that you said you had, go right ahead as well.
Yes, thanks. So this was actually the question that I wanted to address, because I think it's actually rightly phrased in the sense that you ask, what can we do with current network capacity before having to upgrade it, and that's really what I insisted on when I introduced the concept of grid integrated planning. It's to think about what you can do given the capacity you have, and then how you can optimize to get most out of it for the CPO and the business model and the service the company wants to offer, and of course for the customer and the charging experience. So I just want to add to Ceridia's points that this is really where smart charging comes in, where we believe you can already do a lot without having to wait for the grid to grow, because we know that this may take time, and it takes resources as well. So I acknowledge that for ultra-fast charging, it's very likely that in most sites you will have to do some kind of upgrade because high capacity is involved, and that's why it's a use case that is particularly tricky. But on the other hand, it's all the more important that because high capacity is involved, we need smart solutions, and we plan them right in the beginning to optimize charging. And this can be, adapting speed. It can be to, balance load of different EVs connected depending on how big the hub is. It can be, depending on the power signals you get and how granular they are, to provide really short and fast responses. So there are a number of really interesting, flexibility services that can be exploited, even with, the time window of charging, let's say 15 or 20 minutes. And we need to enable these as the market grows. And only if all these, let's say, smart charging service options are exploited, are optimized behind the meter in energy speak, then we should think about growing the physical grid connection of the whole site, because that is for sure going to involve money. It's going to be cost that eventually will have to be paid by the CPO, but also may be passed on to the customer, but also because the costs are caused in the grid, they will have to be paid by all electricity users. So let's avoid these costs in the first place, and get to and help that charging services become profitable. Because what we want to see eventually is a market for EV charging services across Europe that is able to sustain itself, right? We're not talking about the subsidy business. We're talking about infrastructure services that will grow in the market. But we also want them to let's say start in a way that everyone can access, and in a way that they are, let's say, planned in the most beneficial way from the very beginning. So I just wanted to add this sort of perspective here to give it a bit of a more balanced view. I just had a tiny aspect also to Siri's earlier point, because it's so important to sort of rightly size the charging capacity that you offer for customers. We actually do see that, across many different use cases, there may be a use case for let's say non-fast public charging, especially where cars are parked for a longer part of time. So ultra fast charging, for fleets at hubs, etc. But also where, let's say, they don't have to charge fastly or ultra fastly. They don't need to. Why? Because this can also bring costs down, and it can allow flexibility services that help the business case for charging overall in the end.
Thank you, Julia. This also corresponds to some of the points that Alvaro made earlier, I think. So that's great, bringing it all together. Xavier, did you want to jump in on this?
Yeah,
we'll be wrapping up, sorry, soon. So if you could keep it short, that would be great.
No problem. Just saying that I agree with both Syria and Julia's points. I agree that we need to be as much efficient as possible when it comes to investing in the grid, because there are still some power available at some locations, but not at some others. But also, I think that from a commercial standpoint, I think that we should be realistic in the sense that I've been in EV for 8 years, and I see people around me saying that EV is still not convenient. They see still lots of barriers there, because it takes lots of time getting the vehicle charged. There are still the public infrastructure is still scarce. So I think that we need to find a balance between that efficiency and also the convenience to people, because otherwise it will be very difficult to move people from ICE to electric vehicles, as we all will, right?
Okay, thanks for that, Xavier. I think then, if there's no other burning points that we need to discuss, we'll move on to kind of the final question to wrap up. And unfortunately, I think Alvaro's connection has failed, so we'll have to wrap up just the three of us. But essentially, the last question is, and this is a challenging one that I've asked our speakers here, because I know they'd like to answer with about 5 points each, but I've asked them to focus on one. And the question is the following: what would you list as the number one priority that needs to be addressed to facilitate further expansion of fast and ultra fast charging in the short term? And we'll start in the reverse order that we did the interventions. So Xavier, would you like to start off with your answer?
Sure. I will try to be as simplistic as possible, just to address a key message. So I think that we have already, as Siridia mentioned, there are some different subsidy programs behind. There are investors. There is money coming to make those investments. Of course, we will need the power available to make those stations real. But in the end, I think the big, let's say, fence we need to overcome is the permits. So all the permitting process. It's crazy how long it takes for some CPOs to run, or to put in place a station in some regions, just because maybe they don't know how to assess kind of installation like this one. So we need to somehow provide little municipalities and some region governments with clear, let's say, criteria on how they should address and how they should speed up all the authorizations behind let's say, running these kind of facilities.
Okay, thank you, Xavier. So lots of them, but permitting is number one. And Suridia, you are indeed next. What is your view?
Well, if I have to go for one, then let me go for two. I would go for a clear, easy, and rational regulation. And if I may, I could add the permitting, as Xavier said, on the one side, but then also enablers, and not only subsidies, many other measures to foster the EV penetration and the network deployment. So more cars will definitely force a wider, faster, and more professional network. So I could go for those two.
Okay, thank you. So one extra there, but since one was already kind of contained in the permitting, that's all right. Thank you, Suridia. Julia, would you like to wrap up with your number one priority?
Sure, I'm happy to. For me, it's smart planning and smart charging, so that EV charging infrastructure can unlock benefits for consumers, the environment, and the grid.
All right, fantastic. A straightforward and very clear message on the priority. So I want to thank you all, and also to Alvaro, who unfortunately was not able to be with us for this last segment. I would like to thank you all for your wonderful insights here. I think this is a very important debate, which will certainly continue. So thank you all. Thank you also to the Fundación Repsol for supporting this webinar, and thank you to our audience for their great participation and their great questions. And so we'll wrap it up today, and I'd like to invite our audience to reconnect with us for more webinars on the energy transition. We'll be back with more in the spring. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you.